Hi, I'm IKEA, and for today's video, I want to ramble on for a bit about the lexicon of this game, and basically that is the terminology and the verbiage that we kind of use, as not all of it is known to everybody. There's words that even I just always use and don't really explain well, and I wanted to address that, so we're kind of all on the same page in this video then as well, because of course, if you know the word, if you kind of know what it means, you can kind of skip it. We'll timestamp everything per word. So as we'll go through all of the words, and I'll put the full list actually already in on screen, although we might even add to this as we're recording this live. So maybe some additions from the chat will make it in. But we'll go through this list as is, and then basically explain each term and kind of what we mean when we say it, just so we're all on the same page. Because, you know, when I'm talking about a unicorn, some people just see a horse with a horn on its head and don't really know that we're kind of, you know, talking about specific Habsburg or Legmo pieces. Same, for instance, as well. What does meta mean, and kind of what is the basics of DPS and watch-alts and yeah, ticks and dots and stacks and procs, as all of those have very specific meanings, and sometimes as well people use them wrongly. So let's set the record straight, and we'll start at the top of that list. As we go over some of the gear ones, basically. And the first one is roll with double L. So yeah, not roll as in, you know, maybe a raid roll as being the tank or something, but yeah, roll with double L. In this case, this refers to just stat, basically. So we use this interchangeably with stat. So for instance, on this gear, I have a crit chance and a crit damage roll, and then we have a crit damage mod. Re-rolling then as well becomes changing one of the stats, or for instance with some of the exotics where we re-roll them to try to get damage to targets out of cover. With the reconfiguration, we try to get damage to targets out of cover as the third stat, of course. Changing the stats becomes a re-roll, and then for instance the stats themselves, you know, for instance in this case this has a damage to targets out of cover roll on it. And this is just verbiage that has existed around, especially with MMO kind of games for forever, anything that has stats. Very simple, but important to know. And yeah, when you don't know it, it can get you into trouble. And next up then we have Godroll, which is a specific term. And I feel it should mean a specific thing. A lot of people use it kind of just for maxed out stats. I disagree. To me, a Godroll needs to be a maxed out stats on everything, preferably. And then, together with that, it needs to be useful. So, for instance, if this weapon had come with, let's say, swap speed and, I don't know, fast hands or something, this wouldn't be a Godroll. Instead, this Mark 16, which I think actually doesn't even have a, or Mark 17, that doesn't even have an optimization. So yeah, not even a hidden optimization on that detox. This is, for instance, a Godroll. So it has come with all of the stats that we need, so we can recalibrate the talent onto it that we want. Generally, just one stat being full is a max stat. It's not a Godroll of that stat. A Godroll really means truly a roll from the gods, and not just a maxed out statted one. Because, for instance, yeah, as we talked about, some of the third stats, a weapon with the wrong third stat, with the wrong talent on it, that is basically, you can't make it workable, I personally wouldn't call a Godroll. A Godroll, in this case, for instance, for weapons, would be having damage to targets out of cover there usually, and then everything maxed out, or what we often say as well, close enough to Godroll so that you can optimize the rolls on it yourself. And especially as well, for instance, for some of the exotics, having it come with all of the stats maxed out, even though, of course, here there's no choices in it. This, for instance, would be a God-rolled coyote. And that verbiage is kind of also handy to, for instance, when you're sharing it and such, because then the person on the other end, if you're using it in that way, then they know that it is maxed out stats of the right kind. So it is actually usable, because, of course, a lot of items, even max statted, will not be actually useful, because they might come, let's say if this chest had come with health and let's say hazard protection, although hazard protection might be useful. Let's say health and armor regen, and a bad talent. Even if the stats are full, that is not a Godroll. It is only a Godroll if it actually is maxed out of the right kinds and usable in some way. And next up, a term you have maybe heard me use quite often, and others as well, which is the term unicorn. Now, unicorn pieces of gear, which is what that refers to, are harder to get pieces. Now, generally, for it to be a unicorn, it needs to be a piece that is basically hard to get. So, for instance, the group of pieces here fit that, as we would need to get them with skill haste and skill damage on them, for instance, in this case. So we can recore the core. Together with that, of course, this being a red cored item, normally this comes most of the time with at least one of the stats being a red. So there's some debate there. It's either 66 or 75% of the time. It will roll basically with a red stat at the very least. So it only leaves either 33 or 25% of the time where it can even be two stats that aren't red, or well, at least one of the stats not being red, and seeing as we need double yellow. But of course, that's also shared with double blues, or it being a blue and a yellow. So trying to get some of these pieces can sometimes take a while. Generally as well, for unicorns, true, if you can craft them, that is usually the way to go for them. And yeah, they are some of the harder pieces to get. Same as well, some of the names would be considered this way. For instance, this chest as well with skill damage, status effect, perfect glass cannon, so we can recore it to a yellow as well, would be considered a unicorn. And then we step it up a one from a unicorn to a super unicorn. Now, this terminology that mostly I use and kind of in my bubble has existed, although some other bubbles are starting to use it as well. And what a super unicorn is one step above a unicorn. And this Legmo chest with glass fits that bill. So what we need here is not just two stats to then record this blue core, which it normally comes with, to a red core. We need two stats and a talent. And of course, now we're going into the territory of, adding quite a bit of complexity, quite a bit of randomness to the bunch, because getting that right talent is much harder than just getting two stats that match up. That's why usually as well, you can avoid that. For instance, in this case as well, you could have a knee pad with crit chance, crit damage, Lengmo, and then you could have this just be a red sacrifice. But of course, yeah, there is some benefits to some of these, especially as well. Another famous one is the two pieces of Habsburg with a weapon handling headshot and then either vigilance on the backpack or headhunter on the chest. And as super unicorns are usually chest and backpack pieces that fit that nomenclature. Then as well, yeah, again, just to reiterate then, most of the names don't fit that because these will come, even though they're harder to get, of course, for instance, with the back, in the case of the backbone, they come with a fixed talent. It becomes so much more difficult if you're going for basically rolling random talents. And these especially, most of the time will just come from buying parts of Lengmo from a vendor and such, deconstructing them, and then crafting these. Trying to do it without crafting for super unicorns is usually a step too far. And this next one is one that I actually quite often use. It isn't a common terminology, but every time I use it, somebody will ask me what I kind of mean with it. So let me explain myself here. And that is beautification. So in beautification is that I try to, if I get better pieces that might look better, so for instance, especially Godrolls, if I get the right ones, I might actually replace an item in a loadout slot with that. So for instance, quite recently, I got this Mantis that is, yeah, it is a Godroll. And instead of, for instance, keeping my old one, which was optimized, which will work just as well, of course, if the stats are optimized, if the stats are full, they're the same thing. But I deconstructed that one and then kept this one. And that is kind of beautification. And I quite often do that with some of the pieces of gear that I get. Now, of course, that isn't necessary, but what that leads to is, especially for the build collection, over time, I do have a lot of items that are maxed out. It does take some time to, yeah, get rid of some of the roles, for instance, with optimization. But for instance, with my strikers and stuff especially, try to keep this without any optimizations, just keep any pieces that are maxed out and then make it look a little bit better. Not necessary, but something I enjoy doing and gives me something to still care about whenever we get a Godroll item. And moving on to DZ/PvP names, this is a set of items that are only going to drop in the DZ, specifically drop as loot. Now, they can still be rewarded from other sources. So for instance, from legacy caches, or more importantly, from named item caches, which contain basically all of those items. And some people call this DZ exclusives. They're no longer exclusive to the DZ, so I don't use that terminology. but you may have seen this terminology be used in places. What I'll link to here as well is actually the guide that I made for this, which has basically all of the items, all of the named items, and then lists within these pictures. As you can see, there's several columns. One of those columns is DZ. Those items are only coming from named item caches, especially. That's how most people will get them. Or from actual drops in the DZ. That's the only place where, and conflict caches as well. But there they don't drop, they're still rewarded. I'll link to this guide. This guide is actually handy to know because, yeah, I reference it myself as well. Together with that, also, it has a special items, so some of the items are special. We also list all of those. And also at the top, I should list where you can get all of the DZ names. So yeah, for instance, for the Matador, as I've highlighted here, this is a DZ item, so it will not drop if you could just go target looting for it in Countdown or such. And this is actually important to know because quite often people want to go for a Dark Winter or for several other items that are basically, or Emperor's Guard or Death Grips, although Death Grips you shouldn't use anymore, or yeah, some of the other items, Rail Splitter comes to mind. Apartment, although Apartment actually drops in Capital nowadays. All of those are DZ items, and yeah, if you don't know that they are, you might waste some time. So yeah, check out that guide, as I'll link it in the description. And we come to dot, and dot is something that we do quite often use as terminology. Now, this is actually just an abbreviation. This is damage over time. And I've for that grabbed as well here one of the ways of doing damage over time in Division 2, which is Eclipse, which does it with fire. Of course, as well, for instance, something like the debuff from Pestilence, we would also consider a damage over time, a dot. And that's just verbiage that we always use in especially MMO-style games. This is quite common. Anything that gets applied once and then just does damage over time. It's very simple as that. With Division, yeah, fire, all of the status effects, bleed, all of those. Same for Pestilence, for instance. We apply it, of course, and then it just ticks away at people, which we'll explain in a second as well, what that is. And damage over times are quite powerful quite often in video games, and an important one to know. And yeah, just if you don't know it, it's quite annoying, of course. But that's what this video is for. Next up, a term I used a second ago, and yeah, we should define it here then, which is tick. And a tick is basically the damage tick that ticks away at their health and armor. And especially, for instance, we can talk about, for instance, with this build, with a Pestilence build fully set up, we're doing 1.5 million per tick per second. Now, tick rate, which we'll talk about in a second as well, is then extended of that because, of course, it can be multiple times a second. In the case of the Pestilence, it is once per second. So we can, for instance, say that this build has a 1.5 million-ish tick for the Pestilence. And that is just, yeah, common verbiage that has always existed around MMOs, together with, for instance, especially things that are damage over time, that are dots. And next up is stack, and mostly as well stacks in multiples, because usually if we're talking about stacking something up, it's multiple of it. This, for instance, actually does get used even in the game as the stacks of Striker, for instance, and stacking up to 100 times. We use this in many places, and it might not be immediately clear because for some of the things, but most of the things that we use it for, it does actually list it in the talent, for instance, as well. Obliterate, stacking up to 20 times. This is anything that can have multiple of it on either yourself or the enemy. So for instance as well, the Pestilence ticking, you can have 50 stacks upon an enemy. That is the max of it. And that is a common verbiage to need to know. Especially as well, it's handy to kind of know that term just so that you know that we're talking about, for instance, a stacking buff as well. Next one that I use often as well, which is Proc. Now, I had to actually go look this up as I always had it in my head of programmed occurrence, this being what this term comes from. It actually turns out that generally the accepted term is programmed random occurrence, so that R is actually a separate one. And that's also, once you hear that term, it should kind of click. It's a programmed thing that can occur, now random or by chance. So for instance, when we're talking about procking Obliterate, it procs with crit chance hits. Same for strikers. Any hit that happens procs a stack. And yeah, this is common verbiage again as well for a lot of MMO style games, which Division kind of fits into. And yeah, very handy term to know, because I will quite often talk about, for instance, needing to get a kill to, for instance, proc killer, or yeah, having your crit chance be high so you can proc obliterate consistently. And next up, a term that is closely related to tick, of course, and this is tick rate. So the tick rate is actually two things. We'll discuss both of them. So first of all, it's, for instance, in Division, Pestilence, for instance, ticks once per second, so it has a 1 second tick rate. In the case of, for instance, Fire and such, actually, it's twice a second. So every second, if you have Fire on an enemy, or Bleed, or basically any of the status effects, they are twice per second. Same for the Val as well. It ticks away at them twice per second. And that's, for instance, when we talk about Fire, it has a tick rate of twice per second. So that is important, because if we're kind of comparing damages and such to other things, you need to know that, because otherwise you'll have its damage if you think it's just once per second. The other way that this gets used, which is also much more for online games and such, but also actually applies, for instance, in the Division as well, for when we are talking about, for instance, DZ and PvP. And that is how often basically the game and the server kind of communicate with each other, and how fast basically the interval is between actions. So especially with games with low tick rates, what will happen is that what the server thinks is happening and what this client thinks is happening is going to be much more out of sync if it's just 10 times per second, which like really old games. But even, for instance, with Division, going from Division 1, which had a much lower tick rate in the DZ, where things would get out of sync quite often, which meant that people would jump around a lot more because the server was not in sync with the clients basically less often. In Division 2, we have a higher tick rate and connection tick rate basically. And that means that things look a lot smoother. The people are in the positions that they appear to be. And of course, yeah, sometimes that breaks with some lag switching. But without that, yeah, that's the tick rate. So yeah, a term that is used in two ways for online gaming. And yeah, depending on the context, it should be really clear which one we're kind of talking about. And going on to buff, and it's by extension debuff. So buff as a term gets used quite a lot in online gaming and just gaming in general. So it is basically giving an advantage in some form to either yourself or your teammates. So for instance, in the case of the FI here that I have equipped, we're giving ourselves and our team, and well, we have the chest as well on here. So we're going to 25% total weapon damage group-wide, as long as they are at full health, for instance. And buffs and debuffs are generally just, yeah, we imply it like that. And then as well, one of the things is on the ammo bar there, for instance, just underneath the ammo, that is actually our buff debuff bar. So most of our buffs and debuffs show up there, except for instance, weapon talents, which show up usually on the weapon itself. And then debuffs are the extension of that. So when we apply, for instance, this 9th shot of the Scorpio, which gives a damage debuff to an enemy, well, as well, for instance, the Pestilence is a debuff upon the enemy. We also quite often use that to differentiate between status effects and debuffs, for instance, in the case of the Pestilence specifically. But we can debuff an enemy to do certain things. So for instance, for them to take more damage, but even for instance, foaming an enemy, you could consider that a debuff to their movement. And yeah, very simple term, but yeah, one that quite often gets missed. So just to make the full list, let's actually include it. And next up is ads. And yeah, this video is brought to you by... yeah, I did put a mid-roll there just in case it got some people there. But yeah, ads, as we quite often use it in MMO terms, is additional enemies, basically. So additional enemies coming in from the sides or such. This usually gets used more so in MMO-style games of when we're fighting a boss, more stuff spawns in. But in general as well, this is just basically just the normal enemies running around that we just can quite easily kill. They don't require any special attention or such. But we might just say, we have to kill 4 ads and then the next wave spawns, something like that. And yeah, it's a very simple term, but yeah, if you don't know it, now you do. And next up, we go to, in this case, heavy and Chunga, which is actually in-game term for them is tank. Although we use the tank generally for actually a different type of enemy, which is this one with the Black Desk controller and their mini tanks. That's usually what we call tanks. And then the heavies, I mostly call them heavies, but especially people coming from Div 1 as well, or especially in the raids, they get called Chungas quite often. And what they are the heavily armored enemies that will go up against, in the case of the hyenas and the Black Tusk with that well, LMG or minigun, basically, but both of them are basically heavy guns. Of course, in the Outcast version with their sledgehammer and with the 100 RPM of the True Sun's tank as well. Although, yeah, as we said, so we mostly call them heavy and Chunga. That is basically just the verbiage for them. The game, though, does call them tanks. And for our next one, we're going to talk about boss and named. So named enemies, in this case, or boss enemies, there is actually a distinction between them. So every enemy that has a name above their heads, which also includes actually rogue agents, although their name is rogue agent, all of those are named. Now, boss specifically refers to, for instance, the last name of a mission, which drops basically the tactical assessments, for instance, in a mission and the key. For instance, in the case of a bounty here, the very from left to right, basically the right one is the boss. So in this case as well, the lampad, as it has here, he drops the key, he drops 2 items. He is also the only person, for instance, that has an increased chance at a chameleon. And that's actually important when we come to things like, for instance, the bighorn in the summit. It isn't that any named in the summit can drop the bighorn. It is only boss enemies. And that means that when you're going to floor 10 and trying to farm it there, for instance, when you're leaving one enemy alive and going back to the lobby after each boss skill, because there will be one named, that named will be also the boss. He has a chance of dropping at 5% in this case, or in that case, on Legendary Summit. On floor 90, you might think you have a better chance, but it's 2 names and then 1 boss. Only one of them counts as a boss. Same here with all of these bounties. For instance, on heroic difficulty, 2 of these enemies are basically named. One of them is the boss, and for instance, that boss has a chance of dropping the chameleon, and they'll also be the one that drops the key. And for our next one, CC, crowd control, which is usually the abbreviation used for that. Of course, it can sometimes be different things, but generally when we're talking video games, it is about crowd control, especially in video games like this, where that actually exists as a function. So in the case of Division, that is very much a realm of, for instance, an Eclipse, although of course a lot of builds can do it. And it is effectively controlling the crowd, especially that they either are debilitated in their ability to do damage back, for instance, in the case, for instance, with a fire eclipse on heroic, but then as well, for instance, their ability to just actually move around with a foam eclipse is also crowd control. As you're controlling the crowd, keeping them in place, letting your allies kind of do their work. Now, when we're usually talking about CC, and usually, for instance, the terms for pure CC get used, that is mostly referring to things like you're running jam repulse, blinders, and foam or such. It can also just not be the build. It can just be, I CC that guy by just, foaming him to the ground with a red build even. So it basically refers to applying status effects, mostly in Division 2, just to debilitate the enemy in some form. And of course, Eclipse is the king of that for Division. And next up, a term I used a second ago, a status effect. And also we use it as well with when we're talking about debuffs and that they are different than status effect. And it is actually important to know that. So for the list of what is considered a status effect, you can kind of come to this list in the stat screen underneath hazards. Basically, the whole list of resistances here is the things that exist as status effect. So bleed, blind, deaf, burn, disorient, disrupt, ensnare, poison, and shock. Now, in the case, for instance, as well, with the disrupt, sometimes the term jamming gets used. For disorient as well, confuse is basically the same as disorient, and sometimes the game uses that interchangeably. And it is actually important to know these because these are status effects. That also means they're affected by status effect generally, depending on the source. So, for instance, with the Scorpio, It is depending on how many pellets it hits. So you do need to read the talent, but if you're just applying it with a skill, for instance, let's say we're using a jammer pulse to get some disruption out, that will get affected by status effect, and then debuffs generally don't. In the game world as well, things like status effects usually have an orange visual to them, and debuffs have a red icon above the enemy. And yeah, usually debuffs do not benefit from things like status effect and such. So it is actually important, or the status effect stat especially. So it is important to know which ones are and aren't status effects. And next up, we have Spec. And generally what I use this for to mean is specialization, a shortening of that. So which specialization we go with. Now, of course, it is important sometimes to discuss what spec we are going with as for instance, the technician with its launcher and its ability to have +1 skill tier can be really good for skill builds. You know, mortar builds require kind of demo. Sharpshooter builds work really well with the rifleman spec. But then also as well, one of the ways it gets used quite often is spec'd into. So for instance, in that way, so for instance, I've spec'd into having, in this case, several of the picks, for instance, in specializations of the weapon types. Next up, we're going to discuss a combo, because basically we need to discuss both of them as they're basically related to each other. One being additive, the other being multiplicative. And this is basically implying what it's doing in the background. So for certain stats, they are additive to themselves and then multiplicative to others. This is actually all of the stats. And this also quite often gets misused as well. As a lot of people will talk about, for instance, DTA or DTOC being multiplicative without actually defining the other part, because both of these terms basically require a certain thing, which is that it needs to say to itself or to others. Otherwise, you're kind of missing an important part of that discussion. Generally, the part we're concerned about is to itself, because in Division, most of the things are multiplicative to each other. So weapon damage is multiplicative to, for instance, let's say crit and such, except for a few exceptions, of course, where crit and headshot are additive to each other to the same pool before they multiply against the others. There's, of course, a whole in-depth guide on this if you want to go more in-depth into it. But at its core, stat pools, so for instance, weapon damage, damage to targets out of cover, DTA, DTH, crit damage, and then headshot together as one pool. All of those are additive to a pool, and then they multiply against each other. In general, nothing really in Division 2 except for Intimidate and the stacking buff of Hunter's Fury could be described as multiplicative in the way that most games use it, which is multiplicative to itself. Because yeah, if you have two sources of DTOC, if we were to have Fox's Prayer and we would have on the weapon some damage to targets out of cover, they don't multiply against each other. They are additive to each other before they multiply against the rest. And generally, that is also the way to kind of actually talk about these stats is additive by itself doesn't mean much. You need to actually say, for instance, that it is additive to itself and then multiplicative to others. And for instance, in the way of crit chance, crit damage and headshot, they are additive to each other as well, and then multiplicative against the rest. That against the rest or against themselves is a very important part of it, which gets left out. And yeah, which leads to people saying things which I completely disagree with, of damage to targets out of cover being multiplicative, when honestly, it isn't. It is working in the same way as weapon damage is. It is additive to itself and multiplicative to each other. That doesn't mean that it isn't better, but the reason it is better is because it's a separate multiplier, which we'll explain in a second. Next one up as well, one of the things that we quite often use to discuss some of the damage calculation parts of the game, which is AMP, which stands in for amplified, which is also why we have both terms up there. And what AMP is, this gets used in the game verbiage as well. So for instance, with glass, it says all damage you deal is amplified by. And what amplified actually kind of implies is that it isn't additive to anything else. So when the talents are talking about being amplified, they basically are trying to tell you that they don't add into some place else, like total weapon damage, for instance, which is also a stat. Because if you have, for instance, vigilance and obliterate on a build, those two are additive to each other again, and then multiplicative against the rest. Most cases, when we are talking about amps, they're basically single source. So they're just nothing. They're a separate multiplier onto themselves because there's just nothing else that would feed into that pool. And that always means that, in effect, they are multiplicative because there isn't anything to be additive to themselves. They're just multiplicative to the others. Next up, we're going to talk about a term that I quite often use, and that is separate multiplier. And that is just to define that which stats kind of fit together and which don't. Because especially one place that it isn't perfectly clear is that, for instance, all weapon damage here and specific weapon damage, so I'm, for instance, holding an AR here, those two are together in one pool, and together they are a separate multiplier. And everything that is a separate multiplier is going to multiply against the other things. So in this case as well, the things like crit damage and then headshot together are a separate multiplier together. They are two different stats, but yeah, they do add together, and that makes them together a separate multiplier. But then things like armor damage or damage to armor is a separate multiplier. Health damage is a separate multiplier. Damage to targets out of cover is a separate multiplier. And that is actually the thing that, for instance, makes damage to targets out of cover that beneficial, especially, for instance, on high-end builds, as long as you don't per se need a crit chance. So yeah, on Striker, for instance, it isn't actually a great pick to go with a Fox's Prayer. But on, for instance, high-end builds where we have enough crit, we go with the Fox's Prayer, and it isn't that it is multiplicative, as we kind of pointed out there, because it isn't. It is additive to itself and a multiplicative to each other, in the same way that, for instance, the weapon damage is and such. So it works in the same way. So trying to define and say it's because it's multiplicative, it's better. No, it is that it's a separate multiplier, and especially a separate multiplier that we can't actually fill in that much. As we go into it, we'll have diminishing returns. Next up, we have the term we just used, diminishing returns. And what diminishing returns are is that within a system that has additive and multiplicative parts to it, and especially separate multipliers that may not be filled in, if we fill in an empty multiplier, so for instance, damage to targets out of cover, if we add 10 there, for instance, to our weapon, we're gaining 10% there, whenever it is active, of course. If we're adding 10 weapon damage to, for instance, here, where we have 100 all weapon damage bonus, we have 30 assault rifle damage bonus. When we add 10% to here, we are getting diminishing returns. And what that means is that when we add 10% to this, we're not adding 10% on top in actual damage. At the end number, basically, our DPS doesn't go up by 10%, the way it did if DTOC was empty and we add 10 DTOC. Instead, we're only gaining 4.3%. The multiplier is basically the new multiplier versus the old multiplier of a 240 versus a 230, basically, or a 2.4 versus a 2.3. That is not an increase of 10% fully, because there's already some stats in there. And that is the effect of additive to themselves systems. They basically give diminishing returns. Also, I want to highlight here, as there's always a lot of debate going around it, of like it being diminishing returns to skill or stuff like that. Those are economic terms. I use the mathematical terms. These are diminishing returns. The returns, which are diminishing. That's all that means. We don't need to go through terms like the skill, which is actually an economic term, which doesn't per se apply here. And seeing as we tackled a bunch of actually calculation terms, basically with the weapon damage calculations ones specifically, although actually they apply to the skills as well. If you want to go much more in depth into that, that already exists. As I made a guide way long ago from this, as this is from, actually it's so old that it doesn't actually even have those update things that I added to my guides much later. But yeah, if you want a much more in-depth look into those, much more so than just the lexicon of them, because that's what we're kind of concerning ourselves in here, go and read this guide or its accompanying videos. Go watch those, as I go much more in depth than we can go here without making this hours long. Next up, we go to meta, and what meta is. And there is a good backronym for it, but it is a backronym. This isn't actually where the term comes from, which is most effective tactic available, which kind of gets brandished around as it it is actually a good descriptor for it, and yeah, a good backronym. Backronym meaning that it got later on, after it became a term, it got acronymed in that way. What meta actually is from meta-analysis. So meta-analysis doesn't just include in-game numbers, basically, but actually what works best, basically. So for instance, in the case of Division 2, for instance, a chest striker, if you're just looking at damage numbers, does a lot more than, let's say, an obliterate striker. So you would maybe go like, oh, that could be the highest damage one, so that might be the best pick. But then in gameplay terms, we see that getting a 200 stacks is actually pretty hard. So going for a 100 stacks one becomes the general meta. And what meta in effect actually becomes is that generally as a community, we discuss things and we go like, oh, this works well. And then people go and try it and go like, yeah, that worked well. And then we all go like, oh, that worked well. That might be the meta. So for instance, as well, with Headhunter, with Determined being, for instance, a meta for getting 5 directives and getting very easy, of course, with Determined to get some XP in. Those things are basically just community driven. That's also the important thing about this, because yeah, it comes from meta-analysis, from outside the game analysis. Because for instance, what this also in other games means is that the meta choice is, for instance, not always the best choice, but it's the best counter choice. In RTSs, you see this quite a lot, StarCraft being one of the go-tos, as for instance, due to patches and stuff in the past, for instance, a certain faction would become stronger than the others. Let's say Zerg becomes the best. Then what it becomes, the counter pick to those to go Protoss, and then the meta picks become the items that, or the units that work best against, in that case, Zerg, for instance, back in those days. And this has always existed in a lot of games, where the meta is not per se just the best, because the best is, of course, very nebulous, but so is meta, because, of course, meta will mean different things to different people as well. But generally, when we're talking about the meta, we mean pretty effective things within the scope of it. Because also, a secondary thing to this is, and as we're going a little bit long on this one, but usually there is a certain meta for a certain thing. So for instance, there is a meta for legendary, which is, for instance, to run chest strikers quite often, although obliterate strikers quite often as well, together with a foam eclipse. That is the go-to for there. For instance, for Iron Horse, depending on which of the bosses, you might need a tank and a healer. The meta then becomes to have those in there, of course. And that's also the thing, because the meta is not, for instance, in this case, when we're looking at a striker like this is the general meta, and that's what we're usually talking about as a meta. But of course, yeah, for 5 directive farming, hotshot, for instance, if you go into incursion, now, of course, for instance, a chest striker makes a lot more sense, but then also a chest striker that is set up at 60 crit chance, which is completely different than one that is set up basically for heroic countdown, which has a different meta, basically, striker, which we put at 51 crit chance generally. So because we're expecting a bunch of coyotes, because there's 8 people there. So the meta shifts depending on the content. There is certain metas for certain things, and then there is general metas. And next up as well, a kind of wide term, but we'll try to define it here, and that is DPS. And what DPS is, damage per second. So damage per second is kind of the usual calculation that we use to kind of figure out which weapons or builds might be better choices, as that it can become a comparison point. And this is especially what it is at its core, at least for burst DPS, as there's also a sustained DPS. But here we're going to kind of keep it to burst DPS. What it is whatever damage you're doing times how many times you're doing that damage, basically. So in the case, for instance, of a striker here with a FAMAS, we're doing 1035 RPM, so rounds per minute. Then if we want the second version, or at the seconds mark, basically version, we're just going to divide it by 60, taking a minute to a second, making it RPS, rounds per second. And that is actually 17 and 0.25 in this case. And then whatever we hit for, basically, and usually we, for instance, in DPS calculations, we take it to an average shot where we combine the crit chance and the non-crit chance number times the crit chance percentages to get a certain number that we use as our average shot, which will be as a representation of like what the shots will be in between the crits and the non-crits. And that gives us a DPS. Now, of course, that DPS is just a number for the build and at the certain things that we have. So for instance, if we're putting it at 200 stacks with a striker, that is just 1 DPS at that point. And what we can use that for is as a comparison point, because of course, as we shift RPMs, as we shift damages, if you're just comparing crits to crits, for instance, I can hit, a decent amount with this FAMAS, but if I go, for instance, with a much slower firing weapon that hits harder, this number kind of goes up. Basically, our crits will be higher, but we need to always account that the RPM is kind of dropping. And that is an important part. And leaving that out leads to, people, for instance, going with very slow firing weapons just because they do big numbers. But that doesn't mean anything if you're not doing that number as often as a different weapon that can do it more often, smaller numbers, but more often, and actually get better results. And that also leads us into TTK, time to kill. And that is a different way as well of going about things. As one with DPS, we're kind of just focusing on how much damage the build does within a second. With time to kill, we're also adding in basically an enemy, and we're making sure that we calculate out, or generally simulate even, how long it would take on average to kill that enemy. So what the time to kill is of a specific enemy. My preference generally goes out to DPS, as it is much more usable, I feel, as especially with time to kill as well. It becomes a question of time to kill what? And usually the answer of it is that you have a whole chart of it with basically all of the scalings, all of the difficulties and such, just to have a certain numbers. But time to kill is definitely a term as well that is important to know. Sometimes as well, this just gets used as a general way of talking about fast time to kill or slow time to kill, for instance, for PvP purposes, but also even in PvE. So a build can have a fast time to kill without even giving like a specific number, but just saying, this build has a fast TTK, so it can work pretty well to just blow through stuff, or it has a slow TTK, but then maybe it has other benefits in having a bit more armor or such. So this gets used in multiple ways. There is the specific way of using it as time to kill as a calculation, same as with DPS, but also it gets used sometimes as just in general to say, for instance, in PvP, the TTK is maybe too fast or too slow for what some people like. And lastly here, but definitely not least, watch alt. And this sometimes, of course, gets used interchangeably with mule, being either mule alt or watch mule, or any combination of mule, watch, and alt. It gets used. Generally, for me, a watch alt is a character that just exists to use up their watch points. A mule, quite often, I more associate with a character that's basically overflow for your stash. So you're actually putting some items on them just for them to store that. So in this case, for instance, we're actually inspecting my third account, Nokia. So I have a main character there. Then as well, we have a hardcore, and then actually I have 2 watch alt slots. So for instance, this one is already at level 40. I have ran them through the DZ method and got them to level 40. And I can use up their watch points just to get some requisitions out of it, because we can get all of the resources and the field proficiency. And then as well, I have actually one ready to go kind of setup, although, well, they're running 6-piece OD here as they have some pieces of level 31 gear. But yeah, as you can see here, they have no SHD level. They're level 30 here still. And that is what watch alts generally are. So when we're talking about watch alts, it's just characters that get leveled up to level 40 just for their watch. This is actually a little bit different as well from just alt. So for instance, on main account instead, as I'll /inspect myself, /inspect IKEA, and yeah, that's also a handy trick to know. On my main account, I actually don't have, for instance, watch alts. These are then alts. They are not existing there just to be recycled over and over again. That's usually what watch alts are. Alts by themselves are just just extra characters that you actually run. This is also important, for instance, for people kind of starting out. You do want to eventually, especially if you have a decent amount of playtime, fill up all 4 character slots, making just alts, basically. Because then when you get 1 point on one character, basically all of them get a point as well. And even sub 1000, that can be valuable because it'll let you have some resources and such. Watch alts then are specifically ones made to be deleted once they're empty. So generally, you do want to fill up all of the character slots. You don't want to be watch alting though, which is to delete them over and over again until you're into the several thousands, because you have to kind of see it as time spent per returns on it in watch points. You can kind of guess how many watch, well, you know how many watch points you're going to get above 1,000. Basically, it's minus 800 that you get back in watch points. So you can kind of calculate out how much you're going to get in requisition points. And that doesn't become actually a worthwhile thing to do until you're into the 1500s at least. But just filling up the character slots is actually useful. And those are then just alts. And thus we come to the end of this video. And yeah, I hope you found it informative, as yeah, I did want to make this video for quite a while, as it is a common requested thing, as people will ask me when I'm talking about some of these terms, as for instance, tick or dot or beautification or unicorns. What do I mean? And I can now just point them to this video. And of course, yeah, with everything timestamped and such, we can jump around and we can even give them an exact timestamp to this video and just explain it that way. And hopefully that will also give them the interest to go maybe through the full list and catch all of them. And yeah, I've been meaning to do this for a while, so I'm happy to have gotten it out of the way, even though it was, of course, a lot of terms. Although as well, in the future, if we find even more terms enough to maybe make a follow-up video, we'll do that as well. But yeah, for now, thank you for joining me. If you did enjoy this video, please do any and all of the algorithm things down below, as it does help out. So I'll do that a little bit of shilling here. For future videos, we're going to go do that refactor build showcase. That'll be following this one up pretty shortly, I hope. And as well, again, there's a video I've been planning to do for a while, which is that what is DPS on 0? It has to be 0, and there's been some debate on that from time to time. And I do want to actually tackle that and actually show my case as to why I feel that DPS on 0 time should be 0 damage. So yeah, we'll go into that, a very math-heavy subject coming up with that. So yeah, thank you for joining me for this one. I hope to catch you in the future. And as always, have a good night.